Welcome everybody to our live stream on Michael Howe and his Gentlemen Foresters. That's right, it's going to be a singular topic this time, not sort of the wide-ranging thing like last time. And with me, as previously, is Georgina Stones.
Hello everyone.
Now, Georgina has been working very hard on her project, Michael Howe, Governor of the Rangers, uncovering the history of Michael Howe and all of his gang, and putting to bed some of those pesky, persevering kind of myths and misinformations that are rife throughout all of bushranging history. So what we're going to do to start off with is Georgina's going to take us through a sort of a brief overview of the life of Michael Howe, and then we'll start talking a bit about some of the more particular aspects of the story. If you have any questions, feel free to comment them below or send us a message, and we will do our best to respond to them in the second half of the stream, and hopefully we'll be able to answer everyone's questions. But in the meantime, now is as good a time as any to get crack-a-lackin'. That's a phrase that I once heard. So take it away, Georgina.
Okay, so I know that for many, Michael Howe is a name that they don't really know. Some people have never even heard of him until I started posting in my blog. So Michael Howe was born in Pontefract in Yorkshire in 1787. His parents were Thomas and Elizabeth Howe, and he had obviously brothers and sisters. He served with the British Navy before he absconded, as well as the Army, which he again absconded because obviously life was fairly horrendous at that time, as it probably still is sometimes in those, what would you call it, those, the Navy?
Military forces.
Yeah. So obviously he absconded from the Army and the Navy, and so he had to get back home. So he attempted highway robbery of a miller by the name of William Jackson, which obviously didn't go to plan, and he was captured and thrown into York Castle, where he awaited his trial. I think he was in York Castle for about 5 months, just waiting for his hearing. So then obviously he was found guilty of that and transported to Tasmania for 7 years. The first convict hulk that he was placed on, which was moored at Portsmouth, was the Captivity. And joining him on that vessel were Peter Septon and Thomas Burrell, who ended up being 2 members of his gang, which is, I find that very interesting. So after that, he was taken from the Captivity and placed on the Minstrel, which headed to Sydney. And then from Sydney, he was placed on the I can never pronounce it, the Indefatigable.
That means it doesn't get tired.
And yes. On that ship, there was also James Whitehead. So I find it really interesting that so many of the gang members were all on the same hulk. So from Sydney then down to Hobart, and Michael was assigned to John Ingle as well as Thomas Burrell. He also was assigned to Ingle. And so he stayed there for a little while, and then it is claimed that Michael said that having served the king, he would be no man's slave. So he absconded into the bush, where he joined up with a gang of other absconders, and yeah, that's where the Howe gang was formed.
So that gives us a very good sort of view into where this origin was, that we were dealing with someone who was in the armed forces and then became a convict. As we sort of go through the story of the other members of the gang, we start to see that that's a recurring theme, don't we?
So in Michael's gang, we had Peter Septon, who had been part of the Rifle Brigade, and he was court-martialed in Spain in 1811. We have Richard Maguire, who was a Marine, court-martialed as well. Hugh Byrne as well, court-martialed. And also James Chapman, who joined the gang later on, he was a military man as well. So we have Michael, Peter, Richard and Hugh and James all being ex-military men.
So some of them were obviously very well trained. I suppose in a way that was very vital for them being able to survive in the wilds as they did. What do you think about the idea of these men going out into the bush and being able to adapt to these very kind of foreign conditions to what they'd be used to?
Well, I think that's the amazing thing about Michael and his gang. They knew nothing of the Australian bush. They'd never had to survive in that way. I mean, their ability to adapt and obviously the survival tactics that they learned in the Navy and the Army really proved, I think, to be very valuable to them.
So one of the things that defines these early bushrangers, I've found, is that there isn't this idea that a bushranger is a guy who rides around on a horse sticking up mail coaches yet. That's still about 50 years away. And what we see with Howe and his gang is more of a reliance on travelling by foot and taking what they need rather than what they want. So they're taking supplies like food, clothing, blankets, and that sort of thing, aren't they?
Yeah, so Michael's big thing was when he robbed someone, he would always say it's just what he stood in need of. So whether that's sugar, tea, always green tea because black tea was very bitter, meat and flour, ammunition, knives, swords, cutlasses, blankets, clothing. And even still, they weren't just going in and like ransacking the place. I think that's a big kind of a falsehood about Michael, is just he went in and just kind of trashed everything and took everything. It was only ever what they stood in need of, and he'd always tell the occupants what he or his gang had taken.
And that, I think, is an incredibly important thing to look at with Howe's story specifically, because the traditional depiction of Howe is as basically, a monstrous kind of figure, someone who didn't exhibit any humanity in the things that he did or the way he interacted with people. I think, was it Wells who said he was never known to perform a humane act?
Yeah.
So that version of events has been handed down, and so we've got three main authors, I think, that are kind of guilty of that. We've got Wells, we've got White, and we've got Boxall. They kind of regurgitated a lot of that early stuff. Well, Wells is the origin of it. Most people, when they research Howe, they go back to T.E. Wells and his 1818 pamphlet, where they sort of have all those stories about him murdering and this and that and the other. But they don't question it. They just kind of go, well, this is the oldest one, so it must be correct. But that's not what you found, is it?
No, so, I mean, it couldn't be further from Wells. The truth of Michael and his gang and the way they acted and the people they were, when you read, like when I've uncovered and read the witness statements, and I'm blown away, and I'll tell Aidan, I'll just be in shock, and I'll say, how can people believe this shit? Like, really, I can't understand it, because when you read about the real Michael, it's just a huge difference. It's like you're talking about two different people. It's really shocking, really, that someone can have their character so deeply tarnished and destroyed because of lies and propaganda and half-truths and people being too lazy to want to research it for themselves, which I find really upsetting.
That's a recurring feature of bushranging history, is that rather than going back and digging through old records and old newspapers and things to get the information themselves, a lot of authors will just sort of take what they know from what other authors have written and just sort of amp it up a bit, maybe add a bit of colour to it to make it more entertaining. But typically the truth is always sort of put to one side. which is never a good thing.
No.
But in the case of Michael Howe, it's taken a whole other level. It's gone to this point where the version of Michael Howe that we know is completely unrecognisable from the person that he supposedly was.
Yeah.
What we need to sort of get through all those myths, all that misinformation, and come back to what was recorded at the time, witness accounts, that kind of thing, and then that's where you will see the reality. So we have spoken about this in other places, but can you give the audience a bit of an insight into T.E. Wells and why his work is not necessarily trustworthy?
So Wells was a secretary to Sorel. So his work was the first kind of book. It was a pamphlet, but it was the first kind of book on Michael. Obviously, they wanted it to be something that served as a deterrent for other people who wanted to be bushrangers, and just in the same way that a gibbet was a deterrent, the noose. So it had that same kind of job of hoping that they will read this and they'll read how hated Michael was, and how that he had no support, and they will think that maybe that's not the life for me.
And is it fair to say that there's also an element in there of amplifying the evil of people like Michael Howe in order to kind of take a bit of the heat off the government, which was so incapable of being able to actually bring him to heel?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons why Michael has been, his character has been so blackened and the crimes made so much worse is because, the government needed kind of a reason why it's taken so long, and I think that's what kind of Wells's pamphlet served as, like an explanation as to why it had taken them so long to capture Michael and, kill him, because he was such a black, inhuman monster.
So coming back a bit to the gang itself and how they got by, one of the interesting things is that obviously at the time when the gang was at large, Van Diemen's Land had only just really been up and running for about 10 years, not even. And at that time, there wasn't a lot of currency going around.
No.
So some of you will be aware that due to a shortage in currency and a shortage of international trade, the New South Wales government actually imported a whole bunch of Spanish dollars, and they had these converted. They took the middle section out, and what you were left with was a ring-shaped coin and a little miniature coin, which they called a dump. And the ring-shaped coin was called a holy dollar.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole reason that was invented was purely because there wasn't enough trade going on to be able to generate income. So money was effectively worthless, which meant that those early bushrangers generally didn't steal anything that was valuable because there was no reason that they would ever consider that it was tradable. That they had to take things that were only valuable in terms of their usefulness. So that sort of brings us to, how did the gang keep their provisions up, and how did they keep their sympathisers kind of paid?
So with Michael and his gang, a big thing for them was kangaroo hide and kangaroo skin. So in order to receive provisions and ammunition from their sympathisers, they would trade kangaroo hide for that. So with George Jones, he had a sympathiser in the Coal River Valley who, by the name of William Williams, who supplied him with kangaroo hide. So sorry. So George would take the kangaroo hide down to Williams, and in exchange, Williams would provide him with ammunition and provisions, and that happened also with other gang members who they had their own kind of sympathisers, and the same thing would happen. They would trade the hide for just things to get by.
One of the things I find fascinating about a lot of the Tasmanian bushrangers particularly is that not only did they not use horses apart from as occasionally pack animals, they always travelled everywhere by foot, but they always had hunting dogs. Now, some of you out there will have seen the movie The Outlaw Michael Howe, which we can attest is woefully inaccurate in just about every single possible way. One of which is that they steal at one point a dog, the little Jack Russell. Wouldn't have much benefit to the bushrangers. The animals they were normally stealing were kangaroo hounds, which were basically like stag hounds and Irish wolfhounds and things like that, weren't they?
Yeah, they were.
So these were acting not only as guard dogs, but the hunting dogs, weren't they?
Yeah, so the dogs provided them obviously with security, because if soldiers were coming over the hill, obviously the dogs would bark and make noise and the gang would know. They also served, as Aidan was saying, in capturing kangaroos, and obviously kangaroos for the meat and also for the hide, also as well as trading in the hide and the skin that was good, made good clothes, cloaks and caps and knapsacks and blankets and everything, really.
And Michael Howe was pretty handy with a needle and thread, wasn't he?
Yeah, so one of my favourite details about Michael comes from James Calder, who really is the wealth of information. So between Aidan and I, we've been typing up his work to share with everyone, because it's just such a marvellous thing to have. And he knew a lot of people who knew Michael. I mean, he was, writing just after that time, so very close during that time. And when Michael was awaiting his pardon in 1817, one of the things that he would do to make money for himself would be to knit. So he was knitting scarves and caps and maybe even little gloves, and he was selling them outside the jail. So Michael had a bench there where he'd sit and he'd knit and make coin for himself, and I find that a really fascinating detail.
And they tended to make themselves cloaks and caps and moccasins out of the kangaroo skins, didn't they?
Yeah, so one of the huts that they had that was raided by soldiers, it was found like a huge stack of kangaroo hide, as well as heaps of needles and thread. There is when they're at Davies, Christmas Day in 1816, George Jones, one of the things that he specifically requests is a needle and thread, as well as a thimble. A thimble. So they were making themselves a lot of clothing, and I just find it really remarkable when you compare like their resourcefulness to later outlaws.
And I think one of the things that really defines Michael Howe's gang from a lot of the other gangs, apart from its size, which I think the accurate estimate of how many there were in the gang at one stage was 14, is that?
Which is true, yeah. When you read about there being hundreds or over 20, there were two gangs. Like sometimes there'd be John Mills in charge of one gang and Michael in charge of another, but that's like saying, that's kind of like saying that, the Kellys and Andrew Scott's gang were together, like counting them as one.
Yeah, or to say that Frank Gardner's gang and Ben Hall's gang were the same, Because, I mean, the thing with bushranger gangs is you've got members changing all the time.
Yeah.
Regardless of when that is. But there's always a core group. And Howe's core group was mostly himself. Early on it was James Whitehead, Geary, Septon, George Jones. Who else? I can't remember.
Hugh Byrne, Richard Maguire, and Richard Collier.
Yep. Okay. See, I always have trouble remembering, but Georgina here knows all of the members much better than I do. Partly because she's been doing a lot of research into the backstories of the gang members. A lot more than what anyone else has done before, and you've come up with some very interesting information on at least a couple of the gang members that nobody's really twigged to before.
No, so obviously when I research stuff, I really pour myself into my topic. So with Michael, I've just been every free minute has been researching him and his gang, and so I've been looking through the convict records and like the Kent assizes and the Yorkshire assizes, and just reading and reading. And so I found out a lot of interesting details about the gang members and why they were sent here. So with one of them, with Richard Collier, at age 13, he was sentenced to life. He was, originally it was going to be a hanging offence, but that was, what did you say the word?
Commuted.
Commuted to life. So he was 13. Thomas Bowles was 42, I believe, and they were sentenced for committing an unnatural crime.
I think some of the more inventive in the audience can probably work out what was considered an unnatural act back in the 1800s and the late 1700s between two males.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's very sad, obviously. And so he was sent out here in 1800. So what I find really interesting about that is you've got between 1800, from when he was sent out here, to when he joined the gang, which would have been, late 1813, 1814, and it's just more pieces of the puzzle that you have to try and put together. In regards to, well, how did Collier meet Michael? And
Now, one of the big problems that we came across very, very early on was we often, when we read about Michael Howe, we hear about John Whitehead, how he was this awful man who used to collect Aboriginal women to act as his slaves and so on and so forth. But the problem is, when we started going back and trying to find reports and things, it was very hard to find anything about John Whitehead. So I went back and looked up. There's a website, Convict Records, which is very, very useful if you're trying to find a clue as to where a convict came from. Now, there's a few John Whiteheads, but there was one that I went, this guy fits right into the time frame. I got really, really excited, except, his name isn't John, it's James. But then you went and you did a bit of a deep dive, and you found out that, in fact, James Whitehead was the guy who was in Michael Howe's gang.
Yeah.
That John Whitehead was a completely different person.
Yeah, so the thing about John Whitehead, so when you've got researchers, now that's a loose term I use, researchers like Boxall, when they claim about this John Whitehead being with Michael, even when you look at that John Whitehead, I don't even know if there's evidence to suggest that John Whitehead and Michael were even in a gang. So with James, he was in York Castle with Michael, and he was sent over on the Indefatigable, and then again to Hobart with Michael. Now, I can't say positively if he was assigned to John Ingle with Michael, but we do know that when him and Michael had given themselves up in 1814, that he was with Michael, because one of the guns that Richard Collier had when he went and stole a sheep on the farm that James was assigned to at that time, which was Mr. Gunning in the Coal River Valley, James noted that the rifle that Richard Collier had was his. So that's the only evidence that I've been able to find yet about James and Michael being in a previous gang. So the James Whitehead, the real Whitehead of Michael's gang, polar opposite to John Whitehead, and the way that he's been
personified, perhaps?
Yeah.
Or portrayed.
Portrayed, sorry. The way that he's been portrayed. So this was a man who, when he was with a gang prior, so when he'd left his assignment because of bad treatment, like they all were at that time, he joined George Watts and William Drew, who were two other bushrangers, and they were burning stacks and sheds and everything like that. Just stealing horses as well. And James Whitehead left them because he just thought those crimes were just atrocious. That's a quote, that they were atrocious actions. Now, for me, someone who's apparently the most evil man to walk Tasmania's earth, why would, it doesn't make sense why someone who's apparently that horrendous would see the burning of stacks and the stealing of a horse to be atrocious, and he has to leave them because he's afraid of their actions.
I think that really kind of sums up the big problem that a lot of historians have had, is that there's that element of, oh, well, this fact and figure on a page says this, so therefore that's what it is. There's no kind of look at the psychological profile of the people that they're talking about. And when there's not an inaccuracy, but an inconsistency with the way a person's behaviour and mannerisms is portrayed, they don't think to question it. They often just sort of smooth over it and move on, don't they?
Yeah. So I mean, even if we look back at James's trial, the people who knew him and the people who he worked for, they said that he was, he had a good character, he was kind. When he was at Triffitt's in 1815 with Michael, and when they were robbing of what they stood in need for, Mrs. Triffitt asked James if she could have back some material that he'd taken, and so James, he gave it back to her and he tipped his hat in apology. I mean, a psychopath with no feeling doesn't do that.
No, not generally, no. And that kind of brings us to something else that really exemplifies Howe's gang, which is their moral set. When they were raiding the property of Humphreys. So Adelarius Humphreys was a magistrate, and he was not very popular with the gang. For a while, he was one of their nemesis.
Yeah.
They went to his house and they were raiding it and taking what they wanted, and then they found something that sort of tipped them over the edge, didn't they?
Yeah, so when they were raiding his house, the things they stood in need for, as they always did, Michael came across 2 sets of leg irons, which, raises a lot of questions. Now, Humphrey was a man who was accused of mistreating his convicts, so why he would have 2 sets of leg irons in his house, I think, is fairly self-explanatory. So Michael, there was nothing that was going to calm him down after that moment. So they went back to the servants' quarters where the other gang members were. Michael got them, they went back to the house, and then he smashed everything. Smashed everything. Yeah, I mean, all of those men had known leg irons. They'd known that persecution, they'd known that ill treatment. And so to know that someone like Humphrey, who they already hated because of everything that he stood for, seeing those irons, really just, everything just, came to the fore.
And that's kind of, you see that over and over again with the convict era bushrangers. They've known the sting of the lash. They've known the pain of being in leg irons and being in solitary confinement and being transported, all that stuff. And typically that kind of manifests in this real hardened attitude towards authority. But what I find really interesting about Howe and his gang is that further to that sort of resentment of the authority figures, you also have them almost working as agents of some of the wealthier people in the society at the time, to try and take out some of their competition a little bit, aren't they?
Yeah, so there's a belief, and this was repeated by George Jones, that they were friendly, that Edward Lord, who was the richest man in Van Diemen's Land at the time, and had no qualms in just taking everything that he wanted for himself, that because he didn't like Dennis McCarty, that he was kind of pretending to be friends, pretending to negotiate with Michael and his gang, so they could kind of attack the men that he didn't like, and therefore get them to move from their property, and so Edward Lord could come in and kind of claim that.
It's not all too different from what we saw with the squattocracy in the sort of 1860s to 70s, where you would have the squatters being made to give out some of their land, and the selectors would come in, and the squatters would do everything that they could to get the selectors off the land because they wanted to get their land back. People like Edward Lord they didn't care much for the rule of law.
No.
And so they had no kind of qualms about getting criminals to do their bidding on the hope of something or other. So in the case of Howe's gang, I believe there was some discussion at one of the robberies that they did that they expected that Lord was going to get them off whatever charges were laid against them.
Yeah, so George Jones told one of Colonel Dave, is that the right word, Colonel Davy? Yeah. He told one of Davy's servants that they had one of their powerful friends was going to talk to the governor for them, which I find very telling. Yeah.
And that's one of the other things that sort of comes up with a lot of retellings of Howe's story, is that there's this kind of belief that he turned on all of his mates in the return he expected to get a pardon, that he sort of gave himself up freely in return for information, but that's very, very far away from what actually happened, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's my belief, as it is Colders, and people who've actually there's not that many of them, but people who have actually cared to kind of look at Michael's life, it's very obvious that when Michael said that he would go with the party of soldiers to look for the gang, it was so he could keep them away. Because if you've got Michael leading the search, well, that gives him more opportunity to be like, well, I know that they're going to be, up in near the Highlands, so I'm going to keep them near the East Coast,
And it's one of the things that I theorise is that because the thing that prompted Michael seeking out the Lieutenant Governor in the first place was that there was this offer of a pardon, that if they surrendered themselves by a certain time, date, that they would have their crimes expunged, as it were. And so my belief, and it's very difficult to prove this, of course, because it's so long ago and so little is recorded, but my belief is that Michael Howe went in as a way of testing the waters. Because it wasn't the first time that this kind of thing had happened.
No.
There was a propensity for people to be lured in by promise of this, that, the other, only to have the tables turned at the last moment. And of course, at this time, any of the things that the gang were accused of was a hanging offence. I mean, even the fact that they were convicts who had absconded was a hanging offence.
Yeah.
The fact that they were suspected of crimes meant that in the eyes of those who were administering the law, they were guilty, regardless of whether or not they'd actually done anything.
Yeah.
So essentially, giving himself over required a certain amount of optimism, but the fact that none of the others turned themselves over indicates to me that perhaps this was Michael taking one for the team, as it were. So that sort of brings us a little bit to the fact that some of the members of the gang weren't entirely faithful to the other members of the gang. And in fact, at that time when Michael handed himself over, there were some rogue elements, weren't there?
Yeah, so when Michael gave himself in, and the gang they split, so you had George Jones in charge of some, you had Peter Septon as a leader of some, and you had James Geary as a leader of some of the other members. And so at the time, you have all of these gang members coming, all of these escapees coming from different parts of Van Diemen's Land to join the gang. And as it happened, that would prove to be their downfall, like with George Hillier, when he murdered Peter Septon in his sleep, slashed his throat, and then he attempted to murder Richard Collier, but thankfully Richard woke up in time and George just managed to slash his throat and shoot his hand, and then Richard got himself into Launceston where he surrendered.
Unfortunately, surrendering didn't save his life,
No, it didn't.
But it did give us that insight into what had happened. And unfortunately, there's very little information out there unless you go digging to actually say what did happen, because of course the death of Peter Septon was laid at Michael Howe's feet by people like Wells.
Yeah, so in some instances, I mean, there's instances also I've read where researchers have claimed that Michael he shot people, or he shot people, some gang members while they slept, which is just an outright lie. I mean, it's not mentioned anywhere. It's just come from someone's head. Like, seriously. Yeah.
And that's part of the problem, is that once one author puts this in a book or in a text somewhere, someone will come along, they'll read it and they'll run with it.
No, yeah.
And by that time, the cat's out of the bag. And that's half of the work of us as historians and researchers, is trying to put the cat back in the bag, because we know that there are so many untruths that are being regurgitated so often that they're no longer recognisable.
Yeah.
But people will just accept it blindly because, oh, well, it's in a book, it must be true. Now, of course, you're also now in the age where we have mediums like film that have helped to entrench some of these ideas. And I think even though people can sort of differentiate between a film and a documentary for the most part, a film like The Outlaw Michael Howe has done a lot of damage to our understanding of history, purely because people don't know enough about the history before going into it to know what's real and what's not.
Yeah. I mean, you had the Examiner newspaper in Tasmania, the Launceston Examiner, quote what Brendan Cow had written in The Outlaw Michael Howe as being in Michael's journal, like as in real journal. And it's like, okay.
Well, the big problem there, of course, is that we don't know it was in Michael's journal because it's gone missing.
Yeah.
It's been missing for almost 200 years.
Yeah.
But this is the problem, isn't it? And the other thing that's really prevalent in the film is his relationship with Mary. Now, of course, in the film, she's only referred to as Mary or Black Mary, but she did have a full name.
Yeah, her name was Mary Cockrell. So the Cockrells were from New Norfolk, so that's where she would have been assigned, obviously as a slave, and that's where she obviously escaped from, and then she's joined Michael's gang. But this belief that her and Michael were in a relationship, that they were married, that she was pregnant, there is no research, there is no evidence for that, sorry. It's just, there's nothing. I mean, as I've uncovered, she was reported to have been with, people like George Jones and Peter Septon more than Michael. I mean, I think really it's the fact that she was, her and Michael were seen together, and obviously with the soldiers taking her at Jericho, that kind of sealed the thing for me to say, well, if her and Michael were alone there, then obviously they were in a relationship, and that's just, I mean, it's rubbish.
It's kind of tabloid reporting in a way. Oh, she was seen with him this one time, and so therefore they're an item. It's like when someone's eaten too many tacos and, oh, they got a baby bump. There's no substance at all to this claim that she was pregnant.
No.
I've not found anything even vaguely contemporary to that which suggests that to be true.
No.
And then, of course, you have to question, like, why did she respond so quickly to the soldiers when they wanted her to give information about where to catch the other bushrangers? And so, the usual answer is, oh, she was a spurned lover, she was angry, she wanted, I think it would take a little bit more to make someone turn that quickly.
Well,
but
yeah,
I don't know.
And, she was fatigued, but then she was able to lead the soldiers through half of the state in a little amount of time. And I mean, there's also the belief that at that time her and Michael had broke away from the gang, which again is just an outright lie, because after Mary had started working with the soldiers, Michael, Peter Septon and James Geary saw them across the river, and so being the men that they were, sticking their fingers up at the soldiers and Mary, it's just, there's so much misinformation and small things becoming huge,
The thing that always sort of sticks out in my mind is obviously we remember Mary because she had a name and she was mentioned in the papers that she was being given supplies, clothing and food and blankets and things from the commissariat in Hobart as a way of sort of paying her for the information she was giving the soldiers. But what doesn't get reported on is that she was not the only woman in the gang, nor was she the only Aboriginal woman in the gang. There was actually a second woman.
Yeah, so there was two Aboriginal women in the gang. There was Mary, and there was another woman who unfortunately is never named, which I think is sad. But so there were two, and again, they were seen more often with Peter and George than they were with Michael. So maybe Mary was George's girlfriend,
But that's the thing, we've got so many of these presumptions that have taken root because if you say something with enough confidence, people believe it, I suppose. But where we come to the Michael Howe story, there's so many assertions that are completely groundless that it becomes very difficult to pick fact from fiction at times. And I know that from when I first started reading up on the story, everything that I read sort of said the same things over and over. I never thought to question it because when you've got 6 or 7 different sources saying exactly the same thing, you go, well, by the law of averages, it must be correct. But it wasn't until I started looking at the contemporary news reports. One that really started to get me thinking differently was the report on the raid on McCarthy's farm, where it's described that someone was carrying a broadsword. Turns out it was a cutlass, not a broadsword. But people who are unfamiliar with bladed weapons probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But the fact that that was a detail that had never been written in any of the sources that I'd read up to that point really said to me, oh, hang on, there's a lot more to this than what we've actually been told. And so I started digging a bit more and a little bit more, and we started to say, oh, well, the official narrative is very different to what actually happened. And then that was when you started saying to me, well, there's got to be more to Michael than this monster. I mean, admittedly, at first it was a joke, you were trying to get me riled up.
Yeah.
But then you started thinking, well, actually, maybe there is. And so as we began researching deeper, and you found more and more sources, and you found Calder, and I was reading Bob Minchin's book. You've got the book there.
Oh, I was reading it too.
Yeah.
So this book, what Bob's done, and very nice of him, is he's taken what's in the historical record for those that don't have access to it, and he's put it all in a book, so you can get this online. The First, the Worst, Michael Howe and Associated Bushrangers in Van Diemen's Land. So I had already purchased the historical record, but then Aidan got that, and then obviously I had to get that too, and so it's good to have two versions of the records.
It just gives you a much more rounded view, because obviously there are some things that Bob mentioned in his book either glosses over or he doesn't quite nail it.
When it comes to Bob, I think he's very much on the side of the of law, and so when you've got Dennis McCarty who challenges the gunfight first, he openly says, "Now you dogs, if you're a man, faces like men." Bob doesn't include that, so and I feel like that is really misleading, because then it's just like, well, Michael just came and he opened fire, and no, they were just minding their own business, and then all of a sudden McCarty is charging at him, screaming that.
That's the thing, and McCarty was not a popular guy.
No,
he, even amongst his peers, he was considered something of a not like a rebel, but just someone who was undesirable. And he was a rebel actually back in Ireland.
Dennis McCarty was a rebel. When he was captured, his trousers were covered in blood. And actually, he was sent out here with another rebel by the name of Michael Downs. Now, Michael became a very close sympathiser of the gang. And just to add something quite interesting, when Michael was obviously, I don't know where Michael was, but he wasn't here on this occasion, when the gang robbed McCarty's in 1814, they had a list of everything that McCarty owned that had been signed and written by Michael Downs, which I find very interesting.
Well, that's more evidence to put in the category of, signs that the gang were actually working as agents for other people. And of course, the thing that jumps out at me with McCarty and his relevance to the story is, of course, it was at McCarty's farm that James Whitehead was killed. Now, this story has been regurgitated in different formulations over the years, but it always hinges around this idea that Whitehead was shot. He told Michael Howe, "Take my watch," and so Michael Howe cut off his head and stopped the soldiers from getting the reward. And of course, all these stories always refer to him as John Whitehead as well, which we know is not true. But when you actually go back and you look at the witness accounts of what happened, it's very, very different, isn't it?
Yes, so Take My Watch is not mentioned at all. It's not mentioned at all in the newspaper reports. It's not mentioned at all. So I think, like everything else that's happened, it's been mentioned later. So obviously you've got Wells, who, maybe is first, and people have just believed that. And this is the issue when little me, is trying to kind of say, well, no, I know it's repeated and repeated, but it's wrong.
Well, that old saying, a lie oft repeated becomes the truth. And that's very much the case in Michael Howe's story, is that it's been repeated so often that, that's just how, and you don't argue with that. That's just what it says in the book, But the fact of the matter is that James Whitehead's death was quite tragic in a lot of ways.
Oh, it was.
And gruesome.
Yeah, James Whitehead for me is one of my favourite gang members. I think he was a real sweet Yorkshireman. Like, I've read nothing to say that he was nasty. I've read nothing that paints him as a monster. Just a real pleasant, nice, polite man who just found himself in a horrendous situation. And, he gave himself up in 1814, hoping, obviously, like the rest of them, that this would be a fresh start for him. So he was assigned, as I said before, to George Gunning, who was I know he was a merchant and a grazier, so hoping for this would be his shot. He'd do his time and then hopefully start a new life. But unfortunately, as is often the case, because of bad treatment, and I guess the stain of being an ex-bushranger, that never left him. So then in March, I believe, of 1815, he rejoined Michael.
The thing that gets me as well, people kind of take for granted that, nowadays it takes quite a lot to become sort of an outlaw. But back then, there were so many different situations that could see people fall foul of the law. As we said before, if you were a convict and you left your work, you could be killed.
Yeah.
For these men, becoming an outlaw was as easy as falling off a log. And it didn't matter whether or not they'd actually done anything. The fact that they were accused of doing things was enough in the eyes of the law. So for someone like James Whitehead, who was trying to do the right thing and then ended up just chucking it in and saying, well, may as well have the game as the blame, that is symptomatic of what we saw repeatedly throughout the early part of Australia's colonial history.
Yeah, and I mean, to quote him, so the week before he was shot at McCarty's, he was talking to a servant who he knew, who he'd worked with as well, and he said that how sorry he was that he was back in this position, that he was back as an outlaw. He was really sorry, and he said he knows that he's a dead man, but he has to make the best of it.
Now, one thing that you always want to talk about when you talk about bushrangers is their nemesis, their opponents. And I think when it came to Michael Howe and his gang, the two at the very top of the tree we have to talk about Lieutenant Governor Thomas Davey and Sorrel.
Yeah.
Now, Davey was quite an interesting figure in his own right. He was a bit of a larrikin, but he was also someone who played kind of by his own rules to some degree. And one of the things that he did at the very outset of the outbreak of bushranging in Van Diemen's Land, this was after the outing of the ovens, wasn't it? Or just before?
Are you talking about the martial law?
Yeah.
The gunfight with McCarty.
Yeah, okay. So, one of the things that Thomas Davey did was he brought in martial law. Now, martial law means that there is a suspension of normal law, that the military have control, and if you're caught doing the wrong thing, you can end up dead, and there's no repercussions. Davey was very heavily criticised for this, but this is before there were Felons Apprehension Acts and things like that, because there was no way in Australia to institute a specific law to an Australian colony. None of those mechanisms existed out here. So, I mean, it was 1823 when the New South Wales Act was passed, which allowed legislative assembly in New South Wales. So, bringing in martial law was the only way that Davey saw to being able to contain the threat of bushranging. And of course, the people that were above him didn't like that because he kind of did it without their consent, didn't he?
Yeah.
So you've got Tom Davey, and then of course he gets kicked out, and in his place, Sorrel. Sorrel is the typical kind of English lord type. He's very much a stickler for the law and the rule of law. And he's not very much into negotiating with bushrangers, is he?
No.
But he still does it.
Yeah, so Michael sent him a letter, obviously, when the proclamation was in the paper in 1817. Michael saw that as his chance, as Aidan was saying, to give himself up, and hopefully the others would come and they could have one more shot at a pardon. And so Michael, he was in communication with Sorrel through William. What was
it? Bejan?
No, Drew. It was
Slambo.
Yeah.
Yeah, William Drew.
Yeah. So Michael had Edward Bejan and William Drew, who who would act as his go-between. So he would take letters to William Drew or to Edward Bejan, and then they would go to into Hobart with them, and Sorrel would read them. So that's how Michael was able to give himself up.
Now, of course, we do know that Michael went back to bushranging. He was told by Bejan that his pardon had not been accepted, that he was to be hanged.
Which no one can act like. Calder and obviously myself and even Sorrel was shocked because Michael was going to be pardoned. They were going to pardon him, he was going to have that shot at another life. But Bejan, for some unknown reason, which I can't understand, Calder couldn't understand, told Michael that no, the pardon had been refused and that he was going to be hung. So Michael, obviously, angry, upset, and everything else, he waited until nightfall, and then he made off up Murray Street. His first point of call was a sympathiser who was, and so Calder spoke to him many years later. So Michael got provisions from him, and then he was off back up into the bush.
Now, by this time, there had been a lot of upheaval with the gang. And it was not long until Howe kind of found himself on his own, kind of cut off from his sympathisers, cut off from his means of sustenance. And that's where we get the image of Howe that is most commonly seared into people's minds. He's got the long hair, he's got this big beard, his clothes are rotting off him, and he's got this cloak made out of kangaroo skins that he uses to keep himself warm, which, you know, he's able to stitch whatever he's got together. And so he's got one supplier who gives him the kangaroo skins and stuff. And that's kind of where we lead into his downfall, isn't it? So, unfortunately, when we get to this stage in Howe's life, he doesn't know who to trust and where to turn to, do he?
No, Michael was he was alone. He didn't know, as Aidan says, he didn't know who to trust. You know, he absolutely hated outlaw life. I mean, when he was in Hobart Jail awaiting his pardon, he told Sorrell that the life of the damned was nothing to it, that a life in hell was better than the life of an outlaw, which I think is really telling. And so he survived by, you know, waiting on the one or this couple of men he had left, as well as robbing stockmen's huts, just, you know, getting food. Sometimes they're kangaroo dogs, because obviously he needed them for their safety and also for the kangaroo meat and hide. And yeah, so, and then he was betrayed by William Drew, because William Drew and George Watts, who Michael had known and who he didn't trust, obviously, and who James Whitehead didn't trust either, and they decided that they would work together to get Michael and to bring him into Hobart Town, and then they'll both be pardoned.
It didn't go the way they planned, though.
No.
Now, we don't know exactly how, no pun intended, but Michael Howe managed to get out of his bonds, and as they were walking him to Hobart, he turned on them. So he stabbed George Watts.
In the belly, yeah.
Then he took a musket and he shot William Drew, and Watts went and hid behind a tree, and he said, "Are you going to kill me?" And what was Michael's response? I'll do for you once I get this thing reloaded.
Yeah.
As we know, we're talking about flintlock muskets back then, so it would have taken about 30 seconds almost to reload the thing. So it was enough time for Watts to get away, but he got back into town and he was able to give some of that information.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is probably about the only confirmed killing that Michael really had to his name.
That wasn't with the gang.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was just a matter of survival.
It was. It was because he knew that them, you know, he'd been betrayed, obviously, by Drew. Like, Michael thought that, you know, because they often met, him and Drew. So he just assumed that, you know, it was going to be like any other time they met, where Drew would have ammunition and food, and then they would, you know, go their separate ways. But instead, obviously, Michael's tricked. He's bound and then, you know, tricked into going in the Hobart Town and then to be hung. So, you know, of course Michael, and of course he was going to defend himself. Like, why? It's stupid, it's silly to think, oh, he shouldn't have done that, but what else could he have done?
Well, that's it, and there's always this sort of tendency that a lot of people have to moralise about these people. Oh, they should have just done the right thing. Well, unfortunately, in the case of Michael Howe and his associates, doing the right thing was not going to get them any favours, as evidenced by what had happened to them previously. And, you know, if he had followed along, he would have been dead. Well, better to be on the run and having committed murders and robberies than be dead. That was the option he had. But beyond that, what we do know is that Howe was very fond of writing. We know that he had stolen a book on gardening.
Yeah, he stole a obviously, I'd love to think that he had a love of gardening back in England, or maybe his father Thomas was a gardener, and that's where it come from. But it seems that Michael, yeah, had a great love of gardening, and I love that. So he took a gardening book from Mr. Pitt at Pittwater, which is Sorel, and so and what makes that even more special is in the fly leaf of the gardening book, he'd written about his sister Mary and the last time he'd seen her, which I think's, you know, just really lovely. And he also had his journal of dreams, which he had. Now both of these books, especially with the gardening book, because he'd read it so much, and you know he'd thumbed the covers off, so everything didn't just fall apart. He bound it all in kangaroo skin. So in his journal, he wrote about his dreams, his lack of sleep, his absolute fear of the Aboriginals and being killed by them, which there'd been a few close calls at the end where he'd almost, you know, been killed by them. He wrote about his dream, the hut where he was living, and the garden he'd like to plant, and the fruit trees he'd like to have, and the flowers, the seeds, you know, so the vegetables he'd like to have. He wrote about, you know, about Peter Septon and George Jones. He wrote about outlawed life. I mean, to be able to have it and read it, I think it would blow a lot of people's minds, even more than just reading the real facts, because here we have Michael's own words. We have Michael, you know, kind of explaining his life and his thoughts, and I think that would really kind of shock people.
Unfortunately, we don't know where they are.
No, so Michael, very sad. I find it really sad. So in one of his last fights with a bounty hunter who had been a bushranger, his name was Big McGill. Now, according to Calder, this was a man who could fight and tackle a bear. We're talking about a guy who's apparently not afraid of nothing. So joined with him was Mosquito, who was a native black tracker. Is that right?
Yeah, so yeah. Mosquito was a New South Wales man. He was an Aboriginal man who had been employed as a tracker. He was brought to Van Diemen's Land because he wasn't necessarily the most law-abiding citizen. And after this incident with Michael Howe, he would go on to become a bushranger in his own right, which ended it with him on the gallows. So yeah, he's a very infamous character and well-known character in his own right.
Yeah, so Michael had just robbed a stock hut near the Fat Doe River, which is now the Clyde. So that runs, you know, from Hamilton to Bothwell in the Highlands. So Michael had just got himself provisioned, you know, his knapsacks were full. And then Mosquito tracked him. There was a fight. Apparently, you know, Michael really fought for his life, obviously, because there's one man against two men. So he fought hard, and I don't know how, but he managed to survive. But unfortunately, he lost, obviously, his knapsacks, his weapons, his journal as well, because that was in the knapsack as well, so that was gone. So I think and that happened in the last month of his life. So I think losing that journal, losing that last thing of communication, of being able to write down his thoughts, now he really is all alone, you know.
And he was more or less reduced to being almost like a wild beast, because he was without his weapons, he was without all of his protection, he was out in the wilderness, he was having to make his ends meet in the most rough kind of way. And inevitably that kind of desperation leads people into doing things that necessarily are against their best interests.
Yeah, so because he desperately needed ammunition and weaponry, he had another man, not really a sympathiser, but just someone who Michael would go and get provisions and ammunition from. His name was Warburton. He was much the same kind of man as William Drew, only very much about his self-interest. Very, he didn't care about killing a mate. Who cares? So Warburton, he thought, well, I know where Michael is, so I know, and he got a pew and a stockkeeper of Edward Lord called Worrell on his side as well. And then he kind of led Michael to the hut of Worrell and said, well, if you want the ammunition and if you want food, it's in there. So Michael, being Michael obviously, it took him 3 hours to go into the hut because he knew something was wrong, but being so desperate and having nothing, what was he going to do? Like, he had no protection against the soldiers, he had no protection against Aboriginals, he had nothing. So Warburton had to kind of stay with him for 3 hours to kind of, coax him to go into the hut. And then when Michael does, of course, you've got Pew and Worrell there hiding with their guns pointed straight at him.
Well, it didn't end well.
No.
So Howe obviously recognised that these people were in there, and as it's recorded, he said, so that's your game, is it? He had one shot because he had a pistol. Fired a shot, it missed. They fired at him. Supposedly they missed. But we do know that he was hit at least once in the back. So he was shot in the back, and he ran to the river. He tumbled down the bank, and as he was trying to get back up, he was wrestling, and he was bayoneted in the back. So he'd not only been shot, he'd been bayoneted, and that wasn't enough to take him down. No. So they ended up clubbing him to death, and that was the brutal way that they took him down. But eventually they did take him down, and then, as they had done with George Jones and some of the others, they took the head into Hobart as proof that they'd taken him. A very gruesome end for someone who had a far less ruthless streak than some of the other bushrangers who managed to live into their dotage, I think.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately that's kind of the thing that you notice, but as the gang starts to fall apart, the way that they are taken is so brutal. You kind of question whether who's more brutal, the outlaws or the people hunting them.
No, yeah.
Because we know that George Jones was hunted down and shot, and he was decapitated, and what was left of him was buried in the sand. And after Whitehead had been killed, his body was taken into Hobart because they didn't have the head, so they went, well, we'll just gibbet the rest of the body instead. And the governor was upset because he wanted the head as well. I mean, there was just such an absolute lack of care for human life. And that was kind of the hallmark of the time, is that a human life was worth less than a stock animal. If you stole a horse or a cow, that animal was worth more than you were. And that's why, so many things were capital offences. There was about 215 different things could get you hanged at that time. 215 different offences ranging from, petty theft. I believe the legal definition was that anything worth more than 12 shillings was a hanging offence if you'd stolen it. What hope did these guys have of being able to survive? And so ultimately, Michael Howe was kind of the last of the gang. And a lot of people believe that with his death was the end of bushranging in Tasmania. They couldn't have been more wrong. Could not have been more wrong. And so from there, he gave way to people like Matthew Brady and his gang, and Martin Cash and Daniel Priest and yeah, so many more. But how are we going for time?
5:10.
All right, so we're now in the second half. That means we can have a bit of a drink. Georgie doesn't wait for a drink. I was going to explain the drink before you started tucking into it.
Oh well.
So, Mad Tom Davy, that was the nickname of the original Lieutenant Governor. Why was he called Mad Tom? Because he was very fond of drinking games and he could drink everyone else under the table. So what we have here is a drink that he created called Blow My Skull. Georgie, would you care to tell the people at home what is in a Blow My Skull?
Well, so we have there's a pint of rum, a pint of porter, nearly the same that of brandy, hot water and sugar and a bit of lime juice, and it's very strong. Now, obviously, I'm only using the standard rum. If you use Navy style rum, that would be obviously I would love to use that, but we didn't have any of that. And obviously, in Davy's time, the rum, I think if you had have just sniffed this, it would have burnt your nostrils, your nose hair off. But yeah, Davy, he was just a character. I mean, he was absolutely destroyed in The Outlaw Michael Howe, as everyone else was. But yeah, just a real larrikin. I mean, when he first arrived into Hobart Town, there's all the people who were lining up to see the new governor full, and there he is. He gets, he's walking and he's like, it's hotter than hell, and he throws off his coat and he's just got his shirt sleeves, and he marches up the stairs of Government House, and people are shocked,
Yeah, he just wasn't your typical kind of authority figure.
No.
So we've made up some Blow My Skull. I've not really had it. This will be my first proper test. Now, I'm led to believe that Tommy Davy was the only one who could handle drinking this stuff.
Yeah, so Tom, this would be like a game. So you'd kind of dare, people would come up and there'd be a drinking game. Now, he could drink God knows how much, and he would still be standing. And so it would be like, he'd want to, it was kind of like a prowess thing. So he could brag about, his ability to drink. So he'd have, his mates who could only maybe have, 2 tankards of it, whereas he could have half the drum of it.
So he's basically that one person who always wants to have a drinking game because he knows he can drink everyone else under the table. And because of that, he was referred to as Mad Tom. He always was up for a drink, wasn't he? So I suppose, and with our appropriate drinking receptacles, bottoms up, as they say. Well, it's very, very sweet to start off with, and there's a little bit of a burn afterwards. Lots of different flavours going on there.
Yeah.
If I start slurring towards the end of this stream, you will know why. Anyway. So, we're now in the second half, and I think we've probably got some questions and things. I can't read them from here, the camera and things are all over there, but you've got your phone device there. You should be able to read some of the comments. So if you've got questions, we'll have a look at what people have been saying, and we'll try our best to answer the questions you've got. So
Humphrey sounds like a creepy guy. Yeah. I think I would agree with that.
Yeah, there's one illustration that I'm aware of Humphreys, and he's got the Panama hat, which at that time was like a top hat made out of straw. He's got his jacket on, it's not buttoned up properly, they're sort of all over the place, and he's slouched back in his chair. He's got a little pug nose and a huge beard. He looks like a drunk gardener.
I think the worst thing is, when Michael gave himself up, he had to be interviewed by that person. I can't imagine the absolute hatred that was pulsing through his body when he had to sit across a table from Humphrey, and you can just imagine the smug grin that would have been on Humphrey's face.
Mm. Were there any other comments or questions?
Just one from Vern that says, that sounds like the media these days, lol.
Yeah, not much has changed. Actually, I think that's really a good point, is that when we go back and we're looking at bushranger stories, with the more recent bushrangers like the Kellys, we've got the benefit of a lot of media coverage. There's a lot of newspapers and gazettes that have a lot of information, whereas back in 1815 and earlier, when this was happening, there was basically no coverage.
No.
I mean, the first time that I'm aware of Michael being referred to in the press was in 1814. Or the first time we sort of get a record was in 1814. It's almost like he just sort of pops out of nowhere. Because back then, news travelled slowly, and people, generally speaking, didn't supply a lot of information. And the information they often supplied was wrong. So, they're not that much different now.
No.
But, at least we can say, it's because of the 24-hour news cycle now. Whereas back then, there was no 24-hour news cycle. It wasn't a thing. Information just didn't travel fast enough for that to be a thing.
Just on the news side of it, what I think is interesting is, this comes from George Jones again, because of their sympathisers, they could have the day's newspapers to them in 8 hours.
8 hours. Could you imagine nowadays how people would freak out if they had to wait 8 hours for anything? I think, if they wait 30 minutes for an Uber Eats, they start lodging complaints.
Yeah.
That's modernity for you, isn't it? Now, we've got another question or comment here. Have you or will you write a book about the bushranger you are talking about?
Yes, so as well as my blog, Michael Howe, Governor of the Woods, if you're interested there, I'll be writing several books about Michael. The first one I'm hoping will be out at the end of this year. It will be much like what I've got on my blog, but more in depth. All my research, and the next book will be a proper biography on Michael, which will be the first ever biography on Michael Howe and his gang, which is pretty exciting. So definitely at the end of this year there'll be a self-published book about Michael and his gang, which I'm very excited about. And yeah, there'll be a lot of information in there that's new and never told.
I may end up writing a book about Michael Howe, but it won't be a non-fiction book. It'll probably be a novelisation which dramatises some of the events. But when we've got Georgie here to do all that work, there's nothing left for me to do really. So in the meantime, where can people find your work online?
So I've got a Facebook page as well. So my Facebook page is Michael Howe, Governor of the Woods. And I've also got a blog on WordPress, which is Michael Howe, Governor of the Woods again. So both of those, I think they're really great resources. So all my research, it's just a constant sharing of my work and my research, and of course Aidan's great illustrations as well. And not to brag, but we have the first kind of illustrated version of Michael that's true, because obviously with my reading of Calder, he was talking to people who knew and who had seen Michael. So we know that Michael was a rough sailor looking fellow, with long coarse dark hair and pockmarks on his cheeks. So Aidan's been able to illustrate Michael and his gang using those descriptions, which I think is really exciting, because most people had no idea. I mean, I had no idea what Michael looked like when I started. So finding that, I think, has just been so amazing, and taking it for granted with my work with Joe, oh yeah, we have the Brave portrait and we have, people's descriptions, but looking at the bushrangers earlier, you've got nothing. So when you find a description, even the eye colour or the hair, or even when they're born, it's just like, wow, it's really important.
And that's something that I try not to take for granted, is that, I'm used to reading about a lot of bushrangers, and there's lots of information. When you read about Ben Hall, we got photographs of Ben Hall, we've got descriptions of Ben Hall, all that sort of stuff. With Ned Kelly, you've got stacks of images, whether they're photographs or they're illustrations or the death mask. But the further back you get, the harder it is, because photography didn't really take off until the 1860s. And even then, it was sort of not very well adopted. Of course, it existed long before then. We've got photographs going back at least as early as the 1820s. But here in Australia, that technology just wasn't a thing. And most people here couldn't afford it. So the only people we have a lot of illustrations of are the wealthy, because they can afford portraits. So you have to rely on descriptions, and there are very, very few of those. So when it comes to doing the illustrations of Michael Howe and his gang and whomsoever, a lot of it is intuitive. Being able to sort of go, well, we know what the costuming looked like at the time, so we can use that as a basis to sort of build from. But in terms of their physical appearance, sometimes it's just guesswork, and sometimes it's wrong. But there's no way to know officially. So it's been a challenge, definitely. And I can tell you 110%, if you think that Michael Howe looked like he did in The Outlaw Michael Howe, you're completely wrong. He didn't wear an akubra.
No.
He didn't wear a leather jacket, and he was taller than 5'6". He was
5'8".
5'8". But he was from Yorkshire, so at the very least, Damon Herriman got the accent right. If you want to know what sort of accent he had, watch anything with Sean Bean in it.
Oh, yeah.
We've been watching a lot of Sharp lately, to sort of get an idea of not only the firearms and stuff at the time, but because some of the members of the gang.
If anyone's seen Sharp with Sean Bean, something that I love is that there is a good chance that in the gang or in the group of soldiers that's portrayed in that with Sharp, there is also, so in historical truth, there would also be Peter Septon. Yeah.
Sorry about that technical hitch. Any movies in plan? Well, I'd love to make a movie, but getting a movie about bushrangers off the grandest country is almost impossible. Unless you're a person who's got a well-established name, and you're sort of in with the in crowd, the only hope that you've got of getting a bushranger movie made is crowdfunding. And most crowdfunding doesn't really get you very far. I know, because I've been involved in trying to crowdfund bushranger movies before. Even a bushranger as popular as Ned Kelly doesn't get his movies greenlit from crowdfunding. So, as much as I would love to do a film about Michael Howe and his gang, and it's an incredible story that deserves to be portrayed on a film in its full glory, it's very unlikely to happen anytime soon. It requires a lot of reformation with the way that we make films in Australia. One of the big things is that in America, they've got the studio system. What that means is that the movies are made by these big corporations like 20th Century Fox and Warner Brothers and stuff. They've got all the money, and they're the ones that fund the movies. And they get all that money back from ticket sales and merchandise. We don't have that here. In Australia, most of our productions are publicly funded to some degree, which means that Screen Australia or any of the state-based bodies are the ones that you apply to for funding. And they'll give you like this much funding so long as you can provide that much funding. But no funding for advertising or distribution. You got to work all that out yourself. And that's usually where it falls down. You can get the film made, but if you can't get it shown or advertised, no one even knows how to see it.
No.
I don't know. I don't get it. That was the problem with The Legend of Ben Hur, was that even though the movie is fantastic, and I still maintain it's one of the best bushranger films. Well, I would say it's the best bushranger film ever made. But I'd also go further to say it's one of the best Australian films made in recent years, despite the fact that it was done on a shoestring budget. But people just didn't see it because, well, where are you going to be able to see it? There was a limited number of theatres available. The only place you could advertise was at the place where it was being shown or online. You had to make sure that you had eyes in the right place at the right time, and it's very, very difficult to do. What I would ideally like to do, I have a plan to make a trilogy of bushranger films set in Tasmania. Michael Howe, Matthew Brady, Martin Cash. I mean, how could you go wrong? These are three of the most incredible stories in Australian history. Very filmic, diverse cast. I mean, Michael Howe, you've got so many people ranging from all different parts of the world and all different genders and so on. So, you know, there's very little reason why it shouldn't be given a green light, but they would say, oh, well, bushranger films don't make much money. Well, if a bushranger film doesn't make much money, it's typically because no one knows it's even there. I mean, even going back as far as Mad Dog Morgan, it was a largely independent film. People don't realise that because, oh, well, it had Dennis Hopper in it, he's a big Hollywood star. Well, back then, in the 70s and the 80s, Australian films had to have American actors in it. Otherwise, they wouldn't get distribution because, well, we don't know any of those people. The biggest Australian actors in there at the time were Jack Thompson and Frank Thring. David Gulpilil was sort of debuting at the time, so even he wasn't enough to sort of get the attention up. So, you know, we've got so many wonderful stories, very filmic stories. I know Matthew Holmes has got stacks of them. He's got Frank Gardner he wants to do. I've read the script to Gardner, and it's incredible. Going to make an incredible film, and not just a bushranger film. It's got romance, it's got action, it's got hubris. There's a very human story there, but people look at it and they go, oh, cowboys and Indians. So, you know, it's this thing of making sure that what you've got is given the green light, and that's very, very hard to do in Australia, unfortunately. So if you know anyone who's got the ability to invest, send them my way. I've got plenty of stories to give ideas for. Yeah, so Robbery Under Arms was a great movie. There are actually quite a few Robbery Under Arms movies. I'm assuming that you're referring to the 1980s one with Sam Neill in it. That's an interesting story because it's not only the film of Robbery Under Arms, but there was a miniseries made at the same time with the same cast and everything. They didn't quite know which way they were going to go because they might have been able to get better distribution in the TV series or the film. They weren't sure at the time. I think it's a very good film. It's not the best adaptation of the story, but it's pretty good.
I've never seen it.
You've never seen? Well, we'll have to remedy that. I've got the miniseries. Yeah, Robbery Under Arms is a very interesting story. T.A. Brown is his pseudonym. Rolf Boulderwood wrote the story as a serial in the newspapers. Became very, very popular, and some early silent films adapted it. And they were so popular that they remade the silent films, and often what they would do is they'd take clips from the existing films and weave them into other films, because they didn't have copyright issues back then, of course. They hadn't been thought of yet. So you often got silent films where they would reuse footage. Now, one person who never made it into a silent film was Michael Howe, unfortunately. The only film we got about Michael Howe is Brendan Cowell's film. Looks fantastic. I like the look of the film. I like the costumes, even though they're not historically accurate. If it was any other film, if it was a fictionalized film, I'd probably love it. But for the fact that it's trying to tell a historical story in a way that is completely inaccurate, does not get a thumbs up from me, I'm afraid. I mean, if you were adapting Michael Howe into a feature film, what would sort of be your focus, do you think?
Um, well, you see, I'm not a filmmaker, so I don't know what, like, for me, I just want to tell things that are most important of the parts of his life, you know, so I'm not the filmmaker, I don't know. I could write a script and then you would cut everything out and say, no. So I don't know.
Well, so you'd probably write a script that was, 700 pages.
Yeah.
But it'd be a good miniseries. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? I thought Martin Cash would have had a movie. I would have thought that too. Matthew Brady as well. I mean, these are incredible stories and incredible characters, but everyone just goes, oh, let's make a Ned Kelly film. I love Ned Kelly, don't get me wrong, and I've tried making a Ned Kelly film. That's been my ambition since I was 12 years old, is to make a Ned Kelly film. But once you start learning about the other bushrangers, you go, well, Ned's not that great, really.
Yeah.
There's so many more interesting characters out there to find and read about. Even if you're only reading the ahistorical versions that have just been repeated and repeated. But Martin Cash, well, that's one of your areas of interest, and that's another project that you'll be releasing very soon, isn't it?
So Martin Cash will also be getting a lot more exposure. I've got a blog in the works, so I've been doing a lot of research on Martin as well. And being a Tasmanian, I'm obviously in lockdown in Melbourne now, but when I'm able to go home, I'll be touring back around and going back through Martin's country and Brady country and Howe country and shedding a lot more light on Martin Cash, especially Martin and Michael.
Well, I mean, the thing with Tasmania is that there's so much of it that's untouched by human hands that you can make a bushranger film in Tasmania without doing too much location scanning. One of the problems, because those of you who don't know, I've been trying to get a film or TV miniseries made of Glenrowan. One of the big problems with finding location is that here in Victoria, everything is built up in such a way that it's either city, suburb, or farm. Well, Glenrowan didn't look like that in 1980. It was mostly bush or cleared bush. The whole area around the inn was just full of tree stumps because they cleared it out to build the train line in. And there's not really anywhere in northeast Victoria that looks like that. And so whenever you sort of got people saying, oh, why don't you film in Glenrowan? Because Glenrowan doesn't look like Glenrowan anymore. And so the only place that we found that would really provide a good location for us to build the sets and everything in was Castlemaine. Beautiful Castlemaine. I look forward to going back up there. But unfortunately, because we couldn't get the funds, we couldn't do what we wanted to do. One day. But if we wanted to do a film about Martin Cash or Matthew Brady or Michael Howe, it's all there. Pretty much untouched.
Especially up in the Highlands.
And, that's the thing, a lot of these Tasmanian bushrangers, they were up in that northern part of the state, which most people from Launceston would say is the better part of the state. People from Hobart would not agree, but people from Hobart would they? If there's anything you learn from history is that people from Hobart have a great history of complaining about things. That's why there's a penitentiary chapel. We found that out when we were doing our trips around Tasmania earlier this year, because the locals in Hobart didn't want all the convicts walking through their church on Sunday. They ordered the government to build a church in the prison. Mm. And now the church is the only bit of the prison that's left. Of course, then there's the fact that the locals didn't want to have to walk all the way to the other side of the city to go to church, so they demanded they be allowed to go to the convict church as well. And then they complained that they had to sit next to the convicts. Mm. Can't please some people. But no, I would love to make that trilogy of films and to really, use the country down there in Tassie to its full effect. Mm. It's just absolutely beautiful and rugged, and everywhere you go, you sort of absorbing this history. Yeah. There's something that Tasmania has that nowhere else in Australia that I've been to has ever been able to instill in me. Mm. I would very much recommend people visit Tasmania at least once. Yeah. Maybe more than once. More than once, I think. I found that you have to kind of do the different halves of the state in separate trips, because there's so much to do. It's a small island comparatively, but there's a lot to do. So I'm very much looking forward to going back at some point when I'm allowed to leave the house. That would be great. Get tested, wear your mask, wash your hands, socially distance, and only go out for one of the 5 reasons that you're allowed to go out if you're in Victoria. Everywhere else, they're fine. Yeah. They're laughing at us, but, the sooner we do the things we're supposed to do, supposedly, we'll be able to get out of this. Now you've had the Victorian experience.
Yeah, I live on a farm, so when we were in lockdown in Tasmania on the northwest coast, I was like, but I can still walk 100 acres of countryside, and now it's like, I'm stuck in the house. Yeah, it's a lot different. But just going back to the Michael film, my priority just like now is just about, righting the wrongs. So book out at the end of the year about Michael, and then a proper biography after that, and yeah.
Then whatever happens, happens. Rebecca says, I'm in Queensland. Lucky ducky you, Rebecca. I'd love to be in Queensland. Mm. One of the things I'd like to do one day is to go up to Queensland and visit places which are associated with bushranging. Particularly the Kniefs and James Albert McPherson, the Wild Scotchman. I've since learned that Scotchman is a derogatory term used by the English towards the Scottish people. The correct term is Scotsman. Don't make that mistake in front of a Scotsman. You'll learn very quickly that they don't like it. Mm. But no, I love like Roma and Lethbridge and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, that would be really nice to go and visit. And Movie World. Yeah. I've never been to Movie World. I went to Dream World, but not Movie World. I'd like to meet Batman. Not the sort of Batman that's part of Australian history though. I don't like him very much. Vern says, I'm in Vic, got the ball and chains on. Yep. Someone knows our pain. But no, it's good because, we can think about all the places we like to go to and then work towards that. Yeah. It makes you really value the travel. I think some people sort of take it for granted. Mm. Even just being able to go to northeast Victoria from here. Mm. Can't do that at the moment. So, someday soon. One of the places I'd like to go to is Geelong Jail. I've been there before. My book is selling in the gift shop there. But there's lots of interesting bushranger history around Geelong that I'd like to explore. So I'm looking forward to going back up there again. What's your favourite place in the high country, Vic? Oh, that's a good question. Narrowing it down is the hard bit. Mm. I'd say at the moment my favourite is the Woolshed Falls. Yeah. I'd very much like to go back up to the Woolshed Falls. Around Beechworth, the thing that's really going for it at the moment, now that they're sort of putting all the Ned Kelly history on the back burner, is the natural beauty that's up there.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about you? Well, with your Joe Byrne stuff.
Yeah, the Woolshed Valley and El Dorado.
Yeah, finding a specific place for you up in the high country is pretty much impossible, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you could go anywhere up in the high country right now, where would you be?
Probably Sebastopol.
The big open field.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm all about, I think, especially with all my stuff about Michael, there's no buildings. Like, I can't just, it's not like with Joe and you can walk down Camp Street in Beechworth and go, oh, there's James Ingram's shop. Joe went in there and he chatted and he got his books and he went home. I don't have that with Michael. So it's really being able to connect with the country, with the views and see what he saw and, the hills that he saw and the mountains that he saw. Yeah.
Well, I've got down here. I'll have to brush up on local bushranging history. I had no idea. There's some great bushranging stories up in Queensland. I'm only just sort of getting into them myself. They're sort of buried a little bit because everyone talks about the New South Wales and Victorian bushrangers. Tasmania gets forgotten, even though they've got some of the most interesting. And I think technically Thunderbolt could count as a Queensland bushranger because he tended to operate on the border there, so he kind of jumped the border a little bit at times. So, but there's a few in there. I will be releasing an article, hopefully soon, about some of the Queensland bushrangers because there's a few. Yeah, they're very minor compared to some of the other well-known bushrangers, but they've got interesting stories all the same. Vern says that Beechworth is his, and close second is Harry Power's Lookout. They're both very, very beautiful places, and I've never actually been up into the Lookout at Harry Power's Lookout. The one time I was able to go, they were closed. It's a funny thing, then, isn't it? You sort of, some places you want to go to, and then on the one time you get to go there, you can't get in. And when we were going to go last year, we couldn't because that was when all the fires were going through. And then it was lockdown. So, it's been a bit of a crazy one. But I'd love to go back and actually go to Howe's Lookout. It's quite funny, a little anecdote I got about that is I was shooting, not last year, the year before, a documentary for a French television program, Invitation au Voyage, which translated, I believe, is Invitation to Voyage. Doesn't sound as good in English. But they were doing a special on Ned Kelly, and they were planning on doing some drone shots up at Power's Lookout, but they couldn't. Apparently they got restrictions on where you're allowed to fly drones in northeast Victoria. And we almost got into trouble because you shouldn't be flying drones around Stringy Bark Creek. No one has to know. The cat's out of the bag now, I think. But we want to go back to Power's Lookout. Not really that keen to go back to Stringy Bark. I've been up there a lot of times. I was there when they opened up the new experience, the memorial, which is a wonderful memorial. But there's just this sort of feeling of, it's just an unpleasant part of history. And you don't want to go there too often. Of course, I go there and I like to pay my respects to the police that were shot there, and just sort of take a moment to remember all the lives that were changed and lost as a result of what happened there. But it's not the sort of place that you go to for fun.
No.
I remember the first time I camped there, the thing that really stuck out in my mind is how pitch black it gets at night. Like, you can't see your hand in front of you. But because of the creek, everything reverberates. So even the tiniest sound sounds like it's right next to you. It's a very, very eerie experience. Of course, where we camped, You can't camp there now because there's big signs and stuff everywhere. But it really gave you a bit of an insight into how it would have been back in the time when the police were camping there, and how utterly enclosed they would have felt. It would have been terrifying, frankly. These are experienced police officers, but only, to my knowledge, Kennedy was the most experienced bushman. And even he would have been terrified, but he would have been better at hiding it because that's who Kennedy was. He was a leader. So, when I think about stringy bark, that's kind of how I view it. You've got your own perspective on that, because you're looking at it more from Joe's perspective.
Yeah, well, that's where Joe's life was changed forever. I mean, they all were. People lost husbands and fathers and brothers. It's just very, very sad.
Yeah. No, it's a very, very tragic thing when you go to some of these places and you realise the horrible things that had happened there. It takes the shine off the apple.
Yeah.
Like, you love the history, but you don't love the history, if that makes sense. And there's a lot of very unfortunate stuff with Beechworth and its surrounds, particularly with the Indigenous population, of course. But all we can do is learn the lessons from history and not repeat them. They shouldn't be too hard to ask, but the problem is that the people making the mistakes are the ones that don't pay attention to the history. Well, they pay attention to the wrong parts of history. But we're working to change that. It's kind of been the point of everything we've talked about, isn't it?
Yeah. Rewriting the wrongs.
Yeah. How are we going for time now?
Just
about time to wrap this baby up. We've got about 10 minutes. Does anyone have any other questions or comments or anything? There's a few people who are watching still. Thank you for staying with us if you've been with us from the beginning. We very much appreciate those of you who tune in. We also appreciate that some people don't necessarily have the ability to, but they'll be catching up later on, I'm sure. And hopefully this video has worked out fine. It says it's still live.
Yeah.
My phone is what I'm using to film this with, and it can be quite disagreeable at times, but it seems to be going all right so far. Fingers crossed, touch wood. So if anyone's got any questions or anything, if you do have a question that we haven't answered in the video, and you're watching this back after its initial broadcast, we will do our very, very best to answer in the comments if you leave a comment on the video. Did read your book, Lynn Rowan, and it's a great read. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's surprising, actually. I've almost completely sold out of the first edition of Glen Rowan. Almost completely gone. It has been entered into this year's Ned Kelly Awards, and hopefully by the end of the month we'll hear who the shortlists are. If I'm very, very lucky, I'll be in the shortlist. I don't know that I will be, because there's a lot of very well-established authors I'm up against, and being a self-published author has its pitfalls in that regard. But the response I've had back about the book has been very positive.
Yeah.
And that is extremely gratifying, because when you do work on a book for 2 years, you kind of want the response to be positive. I know that there are some things that I wanted to change in it, and so there is another version of the book that I'm working on, and that will come out soon once it's all given the thumbs up, and that'll be sort of an expanded version. So there'll be appendices and stuff. It'll be a bit like, if you're into Lord of the Rings and all those sorts of novels where they've got extra stuff that sort of builds on the world. So I feel like a book like that needs to sort of be an experience.
Yeah.
And there were limitations with the way I published it the first time. So hopefully this next version will be a much more complete version and much closer to what I originally envisaged. I'm still sort of tossing up about the illustrations. Now, the first edition, if you've got it, each chapter is illustrated. And at the moment, the version I'm working on, I've taken away those illustrations, and each section of the story is separated into 3 acts, and each of the acts is illustrated. But depending on who my editor, reviewer, proofreader here, depending on what they say, that might change. We'll see. But yeah, I'm very, very pleased that people have by and large really enjoyed it. There are some things that won't fit everyone's particular palette, so to speak, and I understand that. I'm one of those authors that kind of goes with the theory that if you enjoy reading it, someone else will. So when you write what people would like to read. Yeah. Not everyone likes to read the same thing, but I'm very, very, very happy that my writing has been well received. And your writing has been well received as well, for the most part.
For the most part, yeah.
So those of you who aren't aware, Georgina's original project before she got into Michael Howe was an Outlaw's Journal, which is about Joe Byrne. A lot of that is creative writing, but it's all based on her historical research. And the fact that there is so much about Joe Byrne that you've uncovered that hasn't been written about or talked about before is mind-boggling to me, seeing as everyone seems to think they're the expert on Ned Kelly. But then again, I suppose they're not the expert on Joe Byrne. No. Which will be the subject of our next live stream. So when you get into it, there will be an event that you can go and click on for June the 11th at 7 p.m.
Yeah.
And that will be our next live stream. Then says, one of my books I really like to read was about Ellen Kelly. There's actually a few about Ellen Kelly that are really good. Nolene Allen's, I think, is sort of most people's go-to, but Bradley Kaiser's one, the big blue one, as I call it, from what I've read, that's quite good. I haven't finished that one. It's one of those books that I haven't been able to read from cover to cover, but I read sections of it. I don't know if anyone else reads books that way, but when it comes to non-fiction books, that's kind of how I get through a lot of them, is you sort of pick a section and read it that way. But it's quite good because it's not a perspective that most people take. It's not clearly pro or anti-Kelly. It's kind of on the fence a little bit. Yeah. But it sort of leans towards anti-Kelly at times. But that seems to be the trend now. And that rubs some people up the wrong way. But as a certain someone said, such is life. You can't please all the people all the time, but you can please some of the people some of the time. Yeah. A famous person once said that. You remember who it was? No. Neither do I. I think it was Abraham Lincoln. Someone with a beard, probably. Yeah. Do you have a book recommendation for the people at home? Something that you think they should read?
In terms of what?
Well, what do you think is the best book for people to read if they want to learn about Michael?
Well, the first thing, obviously, is my blog.
Apart from the stuff that you've written.
But I'd suggest Robert Knoppald's diary. Is a really good thing. He includes stuff about Michael in there. There's a lot of stuff in there about Matthew Brady, Thomas Jeffries, Alexander Pierce. The day-to-day life of people in Van Diemen's Land at the time. And the other one, obviously, is Bob's book, which is the one I mentioned earlier. Just keep in mind that he does leave some things out, and he does, twist things a little bit. But
it's the most accurate that we've got thus far.
Yeah, it is the most accurate. Yeah. I mean, there's no books about Michael, so it is the most accurate.
Vern says, yeah, got the movie that Russell Crowe bought. I got 2 minutes in to turn off. True History of the Kelly Gang. The less said about that movie, the better. We were not fans.
No.
That's putting it lightly. Some people liked it. Some people genuinely like that movie. No academy of some people's taste, I suppose. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left. So, are there any closing thoughts that you've got that you should leave people with?
Well, I'd just like to thank the people that tuned in and listened. I'm not as good as speaking as Aidan, so I'm happy that people kind of bear with me because I haven't had that much, this is like my second live video ever. But, I just really like to thank people for showing me support in my Michael research, and I'd especially like to give a shout out to those people that comment on the Bush Telegraph, about their interest in my posts, whether it be about Michael or Richard Collier or George Jones or James Whitehead or any of the gang, or just Michael, because that really fills me with confidence for what I'm doing. I'm not writing just another book about Ned Kelly. I am, about Michael Howe. So I don't have that fan base already there, obviously, and that support base. So to have people show genuine interest and support is a really big thing for me. So as I said before, my blog will, I'll keep adding to my blog, and this year, my first book.
It's all exciting times, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I'm very proud of the work that Georgina's done. It's really not only changed my perspective on a lot of things, but I think it will change a lot of people's minds about a lot of things. And that's really what the work of historians should be about. It should be about making sure that it's the truth that is preserved and not the lies. About making sure that the people remember the things that really happened and the people as they really were, rather than an idea of what they were. And on that level, you've done extremely well.
I mean, just a last thing that I'll say is when I told my father, who, that I'd become really interested in Michael, and he looked at me like I'd gone mad, and he said, you better not be trying to make out that he was a nice man, because he was horrendous. He was a thug, he was violent. And I really shoved it back in his face, because I've uncovered all this stuff, and it's like, well, no, he wasn't. Like, he really wasn't. I mean, he was less violent than Ned Kelly. And that is, I'm saying that, truthfully he was, And yet, if you read the Bushranger books, that's not what you're told.
Yeah, fact versus fiction is a funny old thing, isn't it? Vin says, thank you guys for the live feed and can't wait for more. Well, thank you very, very much for tuning in and watching and commenting and asking questions. That's what makes what we do really, really special. Makes what I do really, really special on A Guide to Australian Bushranging, because without people taking an interest and engaging, I'm just talking to the void, aren't I? So thank you all very, very much for your continued support. I very much look forward to next week's live stream where we talk about Joe Byrne. And in the meantime, there will be posts popping up on the page and what have you as per normal. And if you are not a member of the Bush Telegraph, which is the group that's associated with the page, do pop over and click up to join. There is a qualification question, and you have to make sure that you sign off that you agree to the terms of the group, because otherwise we don't know whether you're legit or not. That's the thing, is that we've had problems with spam bots, and we've had problems with people saying they're one thing, and then when they get in the group they try to spam it with other stuff. So it's just easier. There is a question about the Kelly Gang, which most of you will be able to answer. and there is a checklist that you have to agree to, and then we'll let you into the group. And it's a really nice place to just learn some more stuff and engage. And we do try to keep it as respectful as possible. So on that level,
Yep.
I'm looking forward to more engagement. And in the meantime, I reckon it's probably dinner time for most of you folks. So thank you all very much, and I'll let you go and do your thing. And I hope to see from you next week on the 11th.
Yep.
Right. Good night.
See ya.